Well, good morning. We are here in the tail end of Deuteronomy chapter 2, finishing off what we've been leading up to with the various Israelite migrations through the lands of Edom and Moab and Ammon, now arriving in the kingdom of Heshbon. Heshbon itself being specifically a city, but more broadly it's known as the kingdom of Sihon, that was ruled by the king Sihon during this time. The end of this chapter 2, flows into what we'll then of course cover next week, which will be the beginning of chapter 3 and the conquest of the kingdom of Og, of Bashan. And so there'll be a number of overlapping themes, of course, but nonetheless we're finishing here with what really the first 2 chapters have been building up to, which is the arrival of the Israelite peoples at the promised land. They are here now on the verge, keeping in mind that the land to the east of the Jordan River is also, technically speaking, part of what they have been promised so long ago through their ancestor Abraham. And they arrive here at the 2 Amorite kingdoms, as I mentioned, those ruled by Sihon and Og respectively. We have seen in the end of last week's passage, particularly verses 24 and 25, that indeed now they have come upon them, and the fear of Yahweh will be struck into the hearts of all those who have rebelled against him and who stand in opposition willfully and defiantly against their Creator. Here now, through verses 26 to 37, we find this conquest beginning. There's 2 broad areas of theology that we'll be actually covering as we go through. Again, there'll be relation specifically to next week because they flow through quite nicely. But specifically, those are what we call in theology theodicy. For those who write down notes, it's Theodicy, theodicy. And the other is the militancy of God. The militancy of God. That is to say, in theodicy, and we'll explain as we go through, a defense of the actions of God. Now, it might seem odd for us to have a category of theology where we defend the actions of God as if God needed defending by us mere mortals, but that is not quite what it's actually discussing. It deals with what we call the problem of evil. It deals with the vindication of the actions of God, not because so much that we are providing some vindication as if God needed us to be his earthly attorneys, but rather that the scriptures themselves, that is to say God himself, vindicates his own actions. He explains in full array across time and history who he is and what he does, and consequently from that, why he does what he does. It is not so much that I am coming to you, floating on the clouds, providing a great vindication on the part of your God. Rather, it is God himself who is providing the vindication, and I am merely the monkey on the end of the microphone that is explaining it to you. That is theodicy, God's justification. That is, say, self-justification. We'll see that how that pieces together quite logically and quite rationally. The second, as I mentioned, is the militancy of God, or the fact that God is indeed a warrior. The single most commonly used title of God, other than the basic divine descriptors like El, meaning God, Elohim, which also means God, a very interesting word that's actually plural in Semitic languages, as well as, of course, the divine name itself, Yahweh, which we find all the time in most English translations in those what we call the majuscule form, the tiny L-O-R-D in capitals, or as we have been reading from with the translation we use from the pulpit, the Legacy Standard Bible, it just says Yahweh. Apart from that, the most popular title of God is one that we actually sung of earlier in the great anthem of the Reformation, as it's been called. A mighty fortress is our God. Famous hymn by Martin Luther, the great German reformer. And in those verses we sing about the Lord Sabaoth, or Lord Sabaoth. This is the words that you get translated into your English Bibles as the Lord of hosts. Okay? Hosts being an English word that does not just merely mean one who has people over for a dinner party at their home. Hosts, historically in English, means and can refer to armies. Okay? So to say Yahweh Tsabaoth in Hebrew is indeed to say Yahweh of the armies, Yahweh of the armies of heaven. You can also more broadly translate that as God of war. This is the most commonly used epithet, title, of God in the scriptures, particularly the Hebrew scriptures. He is indeed Yahweh, God of the armies. He is the God of war. That's the most common description in your Hebrew Bible, in your Old Testament, and is something which we tend to overlook or indeed perhaps even forget. That the God that we serve is most commonly described as the God of war, as the Lord of the armies, as a militant God. Not militant as we are familiar with throughout history in comparison to the great barbarian kings, mighty conquerors who have gone forth, driven by pride, greed, lust, and everything else in between. But indeed a God who wages war on evil, a God who wages war on darkness, a God who wages war on chaos. You are indeed introduced to this warfare actually surprisingly early in the scriptures. In fact, far more earlier than one might even suppose. You are introduced to the militancy of God in the very second verse of Genesis chapter 1. Indeed, this Spirit of God which hovered over the waters of chaos, this primordial chaos as we've preached on before, this tohu vabohu, this emptiness and void, that indeed then God does not merely leave as chaotic, let alone be himself conquered or overcome by such chaos, but rather he then orders the chaos. He brings order out of chaos. He is the God who orders. He is the God, the one and only, who presides above and beyond all that has been made. He presides above and beyond the very heavens and the earth themselves. And he has conquered chaos through his ordering thereof. One of the primary reasons as to why Genesis 1 is written and why it is structured particularly the way that it is as an apologetic against, particularly in the ancient Hebrew context, the Mesopotamian understanding, the Mesopotamian mythological cosmology, that indeed you had these primordial, these ancient forces of chaos and order. You had them embodied in the great Mesopotamian deity Marduk, who then conquers the sea monster, the goddess, the dragon Tiamat, chaos, and then creates humanity essentially as slaves to be able to keep Tiamat dead and condemned into the underworld. This was the prevailing view. What Genesis 1 does says, no, these two deities, this plurality of deities which come forth from the creation, as far as you, the pagans, understand, this is wrong. Indeed, there is one God who is creator of the very heavens and the earth, who your gods come forth from, not before. And he has conquered chaos, not by struggling in some war, hoping to gain the victory, but by the mere word of his mouth, by the very utterance of his will and being. He has brought order to chaos. This is the militancy of God. It begins with the fact that God is indeed the God of order. And you see this play out over and over and over again. You see this play out in the command given to Adam and Eve, particularly in the federal headship of Adam. He is told to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth, just as indeed God had filled the universe with his order. And he is told to take dominion, to bring conquest, and indeed the conquest of order, to the world out there, untamed and wild. And so the command is given also to the one who is referred to as the Son of God, lowercase s, the creation of God, Adam, where he too, and therefore we too, as people, and as the people of God, are part of this great mission of ordering chaos. Do you see? This is then mirrored and repeated in the most climactic of senses when Christ, before his ascension, most famously in the end of the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 28, repeats and restates what we call the dominion mandate, right, the command that I just mentioned given to Adam. And he does so by saying, all authority in heaven and upon earth has been given to me. Therefore, that is to say, based on that premise, go and make disciples of all nations by doing what? Baptizing them into the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, i.e. be fruitful and multiply, and teach them to obey all that I have commanded you, i.e. take dominion. It's the repetition of the very same command which Christ himself gave to Adam, now reappropriated, reapplied in the new covenant. This is the militancy of God, and what we are witnessing and going to read here this morning is the working out of that very reality. The fact that indeed God is not some barbarian king, but rather is the great king, the high king, the one who we refer to, often by a Persian term, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who is a warrior who conquers evil, darkness, chaos. And we're going to read about that here this morning. So let's look beginning in verse 26. So I, Moses here speaking, referring to himself, so I sent messages from the wilderness of Kedemoth to Sihon, king of Heshbon, with words of peace. Words of peace, and that's important to keep in mind as we keep reading through, keep a memory of that. Saying, verse 27, let me pass through your land. I will go only on the highway. This is a road, a famous road that runs through and around the land. I will not turn aside to the right or to the left. You will sell me food for money so that I may eat, and give me water for money so that I may drink. Only let me pass through on foot, just as the sons of Esau who live in Seir and the Moabites who live in Ar did for me also, until I cross over the Jordan into the land which Yahweh our God is giving to us. There's a number of very important points to understand here. Moses is coming forth as an emissary to the native king, Sihon, with peace. This is essentially a preemptive peace treaty, functionally speaking. He is not coming, as many great conquerors have throughout history, saying, give us your land or we'll wipe you out. Defy us and you will face the peril of our mighty sword. There's a couple of reasons why that's not happening, but the foremost of which is that the response that Sihon would have given naturally would have been laughter. There is precisely, and this is important to understand from a meta-narrative perspective, from the big picture perspective, there is this many reasons for Sihon, king of Heshbon, to fear the Israelites. Zero. None. At all, in any capacity. They have more people, they have more resources, they have a greater army, not merely in number, but in talent. This is a bigger army with more talented warriors. They have multitudes of fortified cities. We only get reference to Heshbon, which was the capital, but they have many fortified cities, heavily fortified cities, even by ancient standards. Zero reasons at all, in this case, for Sihon to fear the Israelites in any capacity whatsoever. If you merely look at this equation from a mortal perspective. Even still, in ancient times, no one looked at it from merely a mortal perspective, and that's something which we modern Westerners, descendants of the so-called Enlightenment, this naturalistic, rationalistic, humanistic zeitgeist that prevails in our day, where we only think of the world as material, failing to account for the logical, spiritual reality thereof, we fail to understand when we come and read ancient literature, like the scriptures of God, that indeed, shock horror, peoples of the ancient Near East did not think like we do. When the Amorite kings, in this case Sihon, is thinking about war, despite the might of his army, despite the talent of his warriors, he himself is not merely thinking about this equation from a purely naturalistic, materialistic perspective, because before they would ever march forth to war, anyone and everyone would make sacrifice to their national deities, to their gods. Animals would be sacrificed, and especially in the context of war, many of the cultures, to the point of an overwhelming majority even in this time, and not just merely in the ancient Near East, what today we would call the Middle East, but indeed around the world, as we know from history and archaeology. Going to war is a big deal. The gods require more than some stingy goat. We need to sacrifice some people. It is more or less a certainty, not 100% because I don't have a time machine yet, but it's more or less a certainty that people, singular or plural, would have been sacrificed here to attain the greatest blessing and appeasement of the gods. Human sacrifice is an almost ubiquitous cultural phenomenon in the ancient world. The Israelites stand out like a sore thumb by virtue of their lack of human sacrifice. Okay? That has to be understood. We have to bridge the gap and understand historical context. So without even mentioning it here, because without being smart, the Hebrew audience who originally receives this thousands of years ago would not have needed to been told this, because they knew it. It was assumed. It was like telling and writing a detail that before Sihon and his army went out to war, they all got dressed. They all put on clothes. It's as mundane as that. There's no need to mention all the various ritualistic sacrifices that they for sure made, because that is normal. It was standard. They're coming into this war, into this battle, not even by their own might, but with the blessing, they hope, of the gods. Do you understand? And that's why this divine aspect, this spiritual reality, is so vitally important. We've seen this before, by the way. We've seen this already in the story of the Israelites. We've seen this particularly in the earliest chapters of the book of Exodus. This God of war, Yahweh, waging war, not just merely or even solely against people, but really, in a far more meaningful and substantive sense, against the gods of those peoples. We've seen that in regards to what we call the 10 plagues of Egypt. Each one of those 10 plagues was a definitive and decisive destruction of the power, supposed, of the Egyptian gods. Each one of those various plagues, okay, which took different forms: pestilence, lice, frogs, storms, blood in the river of the Nile, etc., etc. All of that was very specifically targeting the various different Egyptian gods, especially the last and the greatest, when indeed God brings justice against the Pharaoh and against the Egyptians, where he slays the firstborn sons. And we, in our weak modern sensibilities, look at that and go, how tragic. How could God have done that? That's so mean. Whilst failing to understand that the very same dynasty, decades prior, had done what? Killed the firstborn sons of the Israelites. So this would be called what? Justice. Proportional justice. Did he kill every single last Egyptian child? No. He killed what? Firstborn sons. Exactly the group that the Egyptians had killed among the Israelites. This is where this fundamental principle, by the way, of what we call in Latin lex talionis, that is to say an eye for an eye, we think that that's a statement of trite emotional vengeance or revenge, whilst failing to understand that our entire legal system is predicated on the principle in common law, because you don't take a head for an eye, you don't take a leg, you don't take an arm, you don't take a heart. When an eye is taken, you then take the eye. An eye for an eye. It's actually a statement of proportional justice, of proportionality. I'm pointing this out not so I can wax philosophical. I'm doing it to highlight the theological underpinnings of what we're looking at. Peace has been offered. We'll do business. We're not going to come in and steal your food and steal your water and steal your resources. We will pay you for it. We will give you money. We will engage in commerce. We will approach on foot. You may miss that if you're not familiar with the war context. That is to say, we're not going to ride in here with heavy armoured cavalry and mounted archers. We're going to come in on foot, not war horses. Peace. Peace, peace, peace. All this is peace. What do we then get in response to this in verse 30? But Sihon, king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass through his land, for Yahweh your God stiffened his spirit and made his heart hard, in order to give him over into your hand, as he is to this very day. Now, this is a common area of theology that is commonly misunderstood. The hardening of heart. Again, there's another thing that we've already seen before in the story of God's people, back in those chapters of Exodus, the very ones that I mentioned earlier, especially in regards, and specifically in regards to the Pharaoh himself, where we are told over and over again that God hardened the heart of the Pharaoh, keeping in mind that the heart was thought to be the seat of the soul, okay, of the spirit. All right? That's why it's language we even use to this day. We use the heart, for example, even in our own cultural context, in regards to emotions or to love specifically often. Okay, so we do the same thing. It's figurative. In this case here, we find indeed the hardening of the heart of Sihon, the hardening of the heart of, back in Exodus, the Pharaoh. And we think, if we don't read the specifics of the text, if we don't think through it logically, and more importantly, if we don't connect Scripture with Scripture and allow Scripture to interpret Scripture, what we end up doing is we think that this was a scenario, and we could talk about it in regards to the Pharaoh or Sihon. Let's just use Sihon, seeing as that's the focus this morning. We view it, unfortunately at times, as if Sihon, king of Heshbon, just really wanted to be peaceful and cordial and diplomatic, and he was just a really, solid guy who just was really kind and had a house full of cats that he took care of, and really was just seeking nice, amicable foreign relations. But unfortunately, here comes big old meanie Yahweh and just hardens his heart and makes him really bitter. In case I needed to point out, that's not what it's saying. It's not what it's saying. We think of it, if we don't interpret it properly, that really the individual was wanting to repent and wanting to turn to Yahweh, but God somehow stopped him by hardening his heart. No. Yahweh absolutely hardens his heart in the process of Sihon himself hardening his heart. And notice the way that God does this. It's just cosmically poetic. It's the exact same way in which he does this with regards to the Pharaoh, which I'll cross-reference. Yahweh, through Moses, comes to Sihon with what? Peace. Civility. Right? We'll pass through on foot, no war horses. We'll do business, we won't steal. We'll give you money and resources to buy things from you. We'll do trade with you. Just let us pass through. And you know that we're good for it because you know that we've just peacefully passed through 3 different kingdoms. right? Our bona fides are solid, as you'd say. Coming to him with peace, with grace, with mercy, rejected. Because indeed, people who are not peaceful are chastised by peace. Ungraceful people are hardened by grace. Indeed, those who are merciless are hardened by mercy. Those who are cruel and unloving are hardened by love. The offering of love, mercy, peace, grace, the things that Yahweh is and indeed does, hardens the heart of the one who is unloving, who is graceless or ungraceful, who is merciless. That's what it does. Before Yahweh ever sends a plague against Egypt, against Pharaoh and his people, what does he do? He says, through Moses, let my people go. The offer of peace. He's already demonstrated his bona fides, all but a couple of days prior, in the event of Aaron and his staff throwing it down in battle against the Egyptian magicians. Their staff turned into a very interesting Hebrew word called tanin, which is the exact same word that's used to describe creatures like Leviathan. It's also a word used to describe Satan as well. When you think of that, you shouldn't just think of a brown snake on the ground. There's something much deeper and more profound going on there. That part aside, he's tested and demonstrated his power and authority, just as he's already done here in this story. He's passed through 3 kingdoms already peacefully. Same method, same modus operandi. There's then the offer of peace. Let my people go. Response of Pharaoh? No. No. The cataclysm of Egypt in those days, the destruction of the army of Pharaoh, could have all been avoided if he had have sought peace with Yahweh. This is the consequences for those who reject peace with Yahweh. He comes to you with peace. Peace, which, might I add, he has zero obligation to offer. God would be eminently justified in bringing immediate and swift justice to Sihon. And a failure to understand that comes overwhelmingly and predominantly from a failure to understand ancient cultures. If you had an even elementary concept as to how dark, wicked, and evil such places were, this would seem tame. Constant warfare, constant conquest, constant raping, pillaging, destroying, constant ritual sacrifice, including that of humans, constant sexual prostitution, constant. An entire cultural system enslaving millions of people, when you talk cross-culturally, into a level of superstitious shackles that is actually quite difficult for you to comprehend in your day, in this day, because you are so abundantly separated from it by virtue of now thousands of years of Christian culture, of Christian laws, of Christian kings, who have slowly but progressively and most assuredly eliminated and driven out such dark and evil practices. Do you understand? If you understood what this was like, this seems small. Because here's what we find coming as the very thing that indeed happens. He says in verse 31, in response to the stiffening of Sihon's heart, the stiffening of his own heart, the consequent and kind of woven in with that, the God stiffening his heart, giving him exactly what he had wanted in the first place. We see in verse 31, and Yahweh said to me, Moses, see, I have begun to give Sihon and his land over to you. Begin to possess, so that you may fully possess his land. And so this is exactly what then happens. We read in verse 32 and following. Then Sihon with all his people came out to meet us in battle at Yahatz. But Yahweh our God gave him over to us, and we struck him down together with his sons and all of his people. This passage is giving a very plenary image. It should also be understood contextually how this works, especially when we get into the very next verse where you read in the first sentence of verse 33, so we captured all his cities at that time and devoted them to destruction. Okay. Some of your English translations might say devoted them or put them under the ban. Okay. To keep this simple, this is a very familiar term. Okay. This is one of those areas where, again, bridging the historical gap. Devotion to destruction, or putting someone, or putting a people, a city, a town, a village, an entire kingdom, whatever the degree is, putting them under the ban or devoting them to destruction is an actual decree in the ancient world. Okay, in an ancient military context, it's actually not just merely what we would call a rule of engagement. So rules of engagement, to use a military term, means basically the rules by which we actually conduct this war or this battle. Okay, you can kill these people. Do not kill this list of people. Right? Don't kill. We have this. Right? We have this very tightly controlled, sometimes too tightly controlled. But we do this in our own day as well. When we've had troops in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, okay, very specific target lists of who we're actually trying to either kill or capture, and an exorbitantly longer list of all the people who we are not to touch. Don't kill civilians. Don't kill the women and the children unless they pose an immediate danger. Right? They pick up a rifle, they run out of a building with a suicide vest or a suicide belt, different kettle of fish. Okay? We have those same rules of engagement. Here, this is a rule of engagement. It's a decree. What this is the Israelites, and they would have communicated this very clearly, that they're putting this Amorite kingdom, the whole kingdom, under the ban. We're devoting it to destruction. And what that is a very clear sign to the ones they're going to war against that, A, if you want to flee, flee. Right? Especially women and children. Those who remain will be utterly conquered. Okay? Again, this is not some unique practice. This is the standard laws of war in the ancient Near Eastern world. This is a practice which continued even into medieval times. Right? To give you a parallel analogy, a constant and also a rather consistent tactic along these lines was you were conducting a siege, so let's just say against a fortified city or a castle, whatever degree you want to talk about. You would invest the castle, which means surround it. Okay, so you've cut off their supply lines, they can't get reinforcements, they can't get food, water, all those things. Yep. You would then give the command to the inhabitants of the castle. Anyone who wishes to surrender, come out now, and you will merely be taken prisoner. You won't be killed on our honour. You will not be killed. Okay? So, hopefully, the women and children come out. Some men may come out, maybe not, whatever the degree is. No harm is going to befall those who come out. Okay? And that was an honest system, because if you didn't obey that, you were going to get brutalised the very next time someone else went to war against you. Okay? So there's a very good reason for keeping that. Anyone who then remained in the castle didn't need to tell you, no, we're not coming out and we're going to go to war against you. Their actions were telling you what the answer was. Do you understand? Because the command was, anyone who comes out now will not be killed. You will be spared. If you choose to remain in the castle, you are choosing to take up a fortified defensive position, and it means you're going to fight. Pretty straightforward, yes? Okay? No one complained. Everyone understood. There was nothing ambiguous. It's the same principle. Putting someone under the ban is actually, or devoting to destruction, is actually the name of the decree. And the Israelites would have made this plain. Everyone in the kingdom of Sihon is now under the ban. You are devoted to destruction. Flee now, or you will be treated as an enemy combatant. Perfectly normal, utterly mundane by ancient Near Eastern standards. It's a very normal historic military tactic or rule of engagement. And you have to see that, because what then comes is those who remain are, as the principle states, destroyed because they're enemy combatants. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter how old they are. And this is where we get into this element of theodicy that I mentioned up the top, okay? The vindication or justification of God. Ready? Watch this. Yahweh our God, in verse 33, gave him, Sihon, over to us. Right? We overcame him, that is to say. And we struck him down with his sons and all his people. So we captured all his cities at that time and devoted to destruction the men, the women, and the little ones of every city. We left no remaining survivors. You know? It's entirely possible, even within the context of how this is written in Hebrew, that some did flee. That would have been perfectly normal. It also, by the way, doesn't even matter if any did. If everyone chose to remain, that we don't have any problems here. The command's very clear. You are being given opportunity to flee now. You'll be spared. No one's going to chase you down and hunt you to the ends of the earth, right? You can flee now. Anyone who remains is an enemy combatant. Now, with all due respect, I think this should be fairly kind of straightforward from an ethical principle. If I'm given the command and the opportunity, all those who wish to flee now flee, and I choose to remain here with my wife and my 5-year-old child, oh, I'm sorry, who's at fault? The army that gave me the opportunity to flee, or my prideful self who gets my 5-year-old son killed in the process? And we turn around and think that Yahweh is the problem here. Let me add a bit more to that, by the way, so that you all understand this as well. The Amorites, and the Canaanite peoples broadly, but the Amorites here in this context, have been killing their own children in human sacrifice for centuries. Centuries worth of child sacrifice, particularly to Moloch, but as well as potentially other deities as well. And some modern Westerner is going to stand here and indict God for sending his army forth to kill men, women, and children, as if now Canaanite children apparently matter to the Canaanites. As if the Amorite children now apparently are so precious to the Amorites after they've been murdering them for centuries. For one express purpose, by the way, as far as we can tell historically and archaeologically, making sure that our harvest is plentiful next season. That seems to be the consistent overarching reason. We, parents, we're literally going to sacrifice our future so that we, not they, we can make it through the next year. And Yahweh apparently is the one put on trial. How dare you? You're kidding me. But this is the common argument. This is what, by the way, forget talking about the common atheistic argument or the common secular argument. This is what far too many weak men in my position spend time doing Olympic level mental gymnastics, turning themselves into pretzels, trying to somehow turn this text into a nice thing. And, well, no, Yahweh didn't really mean that. The Israelites, they were actually disobeying Yahweh. And no, Yahweh never did that, because we know that Yahweh's really nice, guys, you know. It's weakness. It's cowardice. It's how soft we have become. This is an eminent act of justice. It's no different than the death of the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. Why did that happen? I explained it earlier. Because they had done the exact same thing to the Israelites. Do you have any idea how many foreign children were killed by Amorites when they went to war. It's not mentioned here, but the Amorite territory during this time period was partly taken from Ammon, because Sihon had just not long before this, historically as far as we can tell, conquered a pretty sizable chunk of Ammonite territory. How many children do you think died in that war? How many killed children do you think that Sihon cut the heads off? This is justice. And this is the justice of God. And this is one of the many lessons that we need to learn. We need to stop being so apologetic for this kind of text, because it comes for two reasons. One, ignorance, like serious, blinding historical ignorance, a failure to understand the horrors of much of the ancient world. So we don't understand historical context. Now, in part, the average person's not to blame. We don't teach history anymore in school. We have a subject, but it's taught by people who are not historians, teaching material not written by historians about things that half the time aren't even remotely historically correct anyway. So we don't teach history anymore. And we wonder why none of us know history. That part aside, it comes from ignorance, and it comes from weakness. It comes from weakness. Every single person in this room has inherited a level of unprecedented peace, the likes of which the world has never seen. We live in a time that is referred to as the long peace. Post-World War II, post-Bretton Woods Agreement, post-United States hegemony of the world as the one superpower now in the world, we live in a time of peace that we have never previously known. Peace tends, as good as it is, it tends to make people soft. It tends to make people weak, because there is no threat of existential demise and destruction. There's no threat of being conquered. There's no need to become strong, to become disciplined, to become determined, right? And people get weaker during times of peace. It's the double-edged sword of peace, so it were. Very nice for the people who have it, not too good for the descendants who end up becoming softer and weaker over time. Nevertheless, what you're seeing here is an act not of barbarism, not of maniacalism, not of brutality. You are witnessing eminent justice. You're witnessing the justice of God coming against those who had slaughtered men, women, and children for centuries. Their own people, other people, and just about everyone else in between. This is the justice of God. We left no survivor remaining. It's also on the spiritual level, God cutting off the pagan practices that had so cursed this land. We also need to think about this in the broader and the bigger perspective as well. Ultimately, what the actions of the Israelites, guided, empowered, and directed by Yahweh are, is again fulfilling through the line of Abraham God's redemption. The redemption of many things, peoples of course, but one factor which we sometimes forget is the redemption of the land. The redemption of literally the eretz in Hebrew, the earth, okay, the world. The redemption. This land of Canaan, is described as a beautiful land. A land referred to, using a very, very familiar figure of speech, a land of milk and honey, okay, which were broadly speaking luxuries, especially in regards to honey. And this was a land promised to whom? Abraham. Did God promise Abraham some dingy backwater, worn down warehouse type of place? No. But a land of great blessing. But it's a land, God's world, God's earth, which has been cursed by sin, and specifically cursed by the sin of the people dwelling therein. Is the earth fundamentally good or evil? Good. the world in which we live, the material world in which we live, is not fundamentally bad. It is not fundamentally evil. It's fundamentally good, keeping in mind that by the time we get to the end of Genesis 1, which I referenced earlier, where God has made the heavens and the earth, when he has then filled the heavens and the earth, he says, what? It's not quite up to standard. I wish it was, a bit better. I can do some improvements. This kind of sucks. I might just redo it over again. No. He says it was good, very good. Do you understand? Pre-fall, before sin, before the curse of sin, before the curse of our actions through rebelling against God, the material world is not some evil thing that is to be escaped. This is what the Gnostics believed when Christianity was beginning. Okay? The Gnostic cults, who are the early heretics kind of trying to infiltrate and poison the church from within, they believed, much like the ancient Greeks did, the Platonic ones at least, that the material, physical world was bad, corrupt, cursed, evil, and it's something to be escaped for what Plato would refer to as the realm of ideals, this spiritual place free from the corruption of the physical. That's why the Apostle Paul, when he's in Athens at the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17, one of the most fascinating things about that incredible speech, one of the most important speeches in all of the scriptures, is it's all going incredibly well, right up until he mentions that the way that God has demonstrated his divine rule and justice in the world is through what? The resurrection of the man who he has appointed to judge the world. And at that point, the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers go, cool story, bro, we're out. They laugh. They go, because to them, the concept of being resurrected into a physical body again was not only laughable, it was disgusting, it was revolting. No, the physical world's something to be escaped from. That's Greek Gnosticism. That's heresy. That's pagan. We don't believe that. That's not what we're meant to believe. Too many people do believe that, but they're not going to find that in your Bible. Otherwise, you can't explain how on earth the glories of the resurrection, physical resurrection that we look forward to, make any sense at all. We're not just elevated some higher dimension, turned into angels, and we sprout wings and just flutter around in the clouds. This is not the Christian understanding. It's become a popular understanding, unfortunately, but it's not the biblical view. The physical world is good. The physical, material world is good. And Yahweh owns it. It's his world. It's his land. Canaan is his land. Australia is his land. Always was, always will be, tends to take a hike when you actually just read the scriptures. And that's an interesting point, might I add. I didn't plan on saying this, but I think we should. When you read through here, as we finish this passage, looking through at verse 35 to 37, we took only the animals as a plunder and the spoils of the cities which we had captured. From Aroer, which is on the edge of the valley of Arnon, and from the city which is in the valley, even to Gilead, there was not a town that was too high for us. Right? They used to say literally too fortified. Yahweh, our God, gave all over to us. Only you did not go near to the land of the sons of Ammon, which they'd just been previously through, all along the river Yabok, right, so which they'd crossed over previously, and the cities of the hill country, and wherever Yahweh, our God, has commanded us. So you didn't conquer the Ammonite territories that Sihon had previously conquered, because that wasn't your land. Sihon, he had taken it. He had killed men, women, and children in the process. And now justice was coming against the house of Sihon and against his people. Now, throughout most of Christian history, clergymen in my position would not have needed to make this point because it would have been so blindingly obvious, right? Because our ancestors didn't tend to be this stupid. But, alas, here we are. A question of application that I'll finish on is this from this text. How much money or resources, are we supposing that the descendants of these Israelites owe in reparations to the Amorites and their descendants? How many reparations, how much money do they owe? Should they pay back money for this conquest? Maybe they should have an annual sorry day where they continuously and repetitiously say sorry over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, I suppose in perpetuity, without any concept of forgiveness tied therein. That sounds vaguely familiar, Pastor. I wonder what you happen to be cross-referencing. Perhaps we should go back. And the Amorites are gone now. They're gone, especially by the time the Babylonians get finished with them, about 1,000 years later. So these days, the land of the Amorites is in what today we call the Kingdom of Jordan. So perhaps the Jordanians, who are actually, overwhelmingly Arab, not from here, but who are Arab, perhaps the modern descendants, ethnically speaking, Jews, should perhaps pay the Jordanians some money for this ancient tragedy, this conquest, this colonialism, this imperialism. Maybe we should do that. No? No one's willing to proffer that argument? I can't turn to channel 7, 9 or 10 and find some delinquent, half-witted politician who's willing to suggest that? This is serious. This is dead serious. This is a gigantic cultural problem that we are currently in the quagmire of, where instead of actually unifying peoples, you divide them. Instead of actually bringing cohesion and unity, what you do is you fester and infect and poison the proverbial well of the descendants of people who did or did not do something to another group of people who did or did not have something done to them. Do you understand? We're going to talk more about this over coming weeks and over the coming months leading into this divisive and racist plebiscite that we're about to have hoisted upon us by our government. But in regards to this, let me say this. The concept that the descendants of anybody owe money to the descendants of anybody is not just merely a horrifically bad idea, it is theft. It is theft. It is a violation, explicit violation of the commandments of God, including particularly the 8th commandment, as well as, might I add, the 10th, because it's definitely covetous with absolute certainty. So we have the bastions of wisdom that preside in the halls of our current Commonwealth government, proposing that we enact into legislation and into indeed the Constitution itself multitudes of violations of the 10 Commandments. And you have people sitting where you are or standing where I am who are saying, yes, this is justice. Yes, this is how we love our neighbour, guys. Come on. This is being nice. Won't you just think of all the justice that's really socially good for us? These are the same people, by the way, who told you to shut up, go home, don't come to church, get jabbed 10,000 times with a substance that may or may not work, and put on a mask, which we also know doesn't work, and make sure you don't stand really close to people, even though it does nothing because you're standing outdoors in the wind. These are the same people who told you that all this was a great idea. It's the same people that told you that you need to trust the experts, trust the white-robed oligarchy that are the scientists, to trust that the politicians have your best interests at heart, which we now know categorically is so universally and totally wrong that we could quite literally be here all day explaining how on earth it is so. At multiple junctures, the same Christian leaders who are telling you to vote yes are the same Christian leaders who told you that the experts, so-called, and the politicians were not only doing what was wise, but doing what was good. It's the same people. And I'm telling you, and explaining to you, and advising you, and encouraging you, as one of your pastors, do not listen to them. Do not listen to them. The fact that they stand in the office of minister in God's church is not, by any stretch, an automatic validation that whatever comes out of their mouth will be true, let alone wise, let alone right. We will talk about that more. But this conquest is the enactment of the justice of God. It is the execution of divine vengeance, holy retribution for the sins of the Amorites, which had been building for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. The men, women, and children killed in the course of battle pales utterly in comparison to the innumerable number of men, women, and children that the Amorites had been conquering, raping, pillaging, and destroying for centuries. We worship, we follow, we serve, we are loyal to, we are duty-bound to, we obey the God of war, who does not merely just let evil run rampant and wild, but rather who brings justice against iniquity, who brings justice against evil, who brings order to chaos, good to evil, light to darkness. This is our God. This is Yahweh. And this is the one who we worship. This is the one whom we serve. I'm not going to exegete, I'm just going to leave you with this reading from Psalm 44, verses 1 through 8. O God, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have recounted to us the work that you did in their days. Here, the work in the days of old. You with your own hand dispossessed the nations, then you planted them. You afflicted the peoples, then you cast them out. For by their own sword they did not possess the land, and their own arm did not save them. But your right hand and your arm and the light of your presence did this, for you favored them. You are my King, O God. Command salvation for Jacob, for Israel. Through you we will push back our adversaries. Through your name we will tread down those who rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, and my sword, it will not save me. But you have saved us from our adversaries, and you have put to shame those who hate us. In God we have trusted all the day long, and we will give thanks to your name forevermore. Amen.